Dateline, Salt Lake Herald-Republican, November 30th, 1879, quote, "Since Mr. Andrew C. Brixton, the present proprietor of the Valley House, took possession, this house has undergone considerable renovation and is fast becoming a popular institution. The dining room has been refitted and is now one of the finest, airiest, and most comfortable in the city. New furniture and fittings, spring mattresses, and other conveniences have been put in the apartments so that there are now 40 cozy sleeping rooms. The parlor is situated at the south end of the building and faces west. Ladies can pass through the dining room without having to go through the offices. He sets a most excellent table. The rooms upstairs are conveniently arranged and accessible to the dining room and parlor and are close and handy to the office. The office is also well fitted up. It contains a nice typical cabinet in which are many beautiful specimens of the minerals of this and other regions together with all local newspapers and many from the east and west. In fact, the work of renovating is still going on, and the young and energetic proprietor is determined to continue the improvements until his hotel shall be second to none in comfort and conveniences." End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolished Salt Lake and the story of Valley House. Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Demolished Salt Lake podcast. Today, you get not only the story of one building, but of 2 buildings. We're also going to span about 130 years of Salt Lake history. So a little background on this episode. I was first introduced to Valley House by my friend Liz when she sent me a picture of it last spring and told me I needed to do an Instagram post about it on my Instagram account. And delving into the history of it, there is just so much cool stuff surrounding Valley House and the building to come after it that I knew it had to be a podcast episode. So you can thank Liz for this one. All right, let's move on to some history. We'll start our story on July 24th, 1847, which if you grew up in Utah, that date should sound fairly familiar. It was when a group of Mormon pioneers led by Brigham Young arrived in Salt Lake City and set about permanently settling the valley. Among those arriving that day was Wilford Woodruff, who would later become the 4th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1889. Wilford built 2 cabins for him and his family. He then moved those cabins to his new property at 10th South West Temple in 1850. The new place would come to be known as Valley House. 4 generations of the Woodruff family called this their home, and it was Wilford's main residence until the mid-1870s when he moved out and converted Valley House into a hotel. This is where our story begins. Valley House was located in a pretty sweet spot. It was on the streetcar and bus line, was close to the business district and the railroad station. It was also a stone's throw from Temple Square, which is where the Mormon Church's headquarters, Temple, Assembly Hall, and Tabernacle were all located. The accommodations were known to be clean and neat, and tables to rival the more expensive hotels in the valley. Now, I'm assuming by the word tables, this means the food and service. The hotel was 40 rooms at rates of $1.50 to $2 per day and $8 to $10 per week, depending on the room. It wasn't just travelers that stayed at the hotel. Local businessmen also made it their home instead of rooming at the local boarding houses. In addition, there were a separate gentleman and ladies parlor and 3 attached cottages available for reservations. Valley House was also marketed to families, stating that the accommodations were child-friendly. There is one item in this hotel that might surprise you, and that would be a bar. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about this. So the early settlers to the valley brewed beer because of the problems with potable water. They also distilled alcohol for medicinal use. Now feel free to visualize quotes around the words medicinal use. Tax records for 1862 to 1869 show Utah had 37 distilleries owned by Mormons and by Brigham Young himself. So most of the hotels in the valley had bars because selling alcohol made money for the church. Now that's just good business sense if you ask me. There was one exception to selling alcohol, and that was the Sunday law, which is, just as you would suspect, no alcohol sales on Sundays due to it being the Sabbath. It appears the Valley House violated this law on several occasions, but judging by the number of newspaper articles about businesses violating this law, they seem to be in good company. Valley House saw a few more run-ins with the law over its lifetime. One in particular happened in 1885 when Fanny Davenport, a locally known prostitute, was charged for running a house of ill repute. On December 3rd, 1885, an article in the Salt Lake Herald-Republican reported that she was arrested and taken to her temporary jail at Valley House by deputies Sprague and Smith. The Salt Lake Democrat ran an article on December 9th, 1885, titled "Fanny's Gone from Our Gaze," that stated, and I quote, "The notorious city prostitute forfeits her bond and takes the 3 o'clock freight." End quote. Fanny, who was out on $1,500 in bond, was due in court, but she never showed. In fact, she never showed up in Salt Lake again. She just simply disappeared. But stick with me, because that's not the end of the story. Brigham Young Hampton, a Mormon and a polygamist, was angry at government officials for trying to end polygamy. So he devised a sting operation to catch any of them in an illicit act with a prostitute. Working with Fanny, he set up a phony brothel with peepholes in the doors so police officers could view the acts and arrest any of the men involved. Well, a few men were arrested, but overall, this plan totally backfired on Hampton. He ended up being convicted of keeping a house of ill fame and spent a year in jail. Now, as for Fanny, I was able to find one article regarding her after her disappearance. It was in the Salt Lake Herald-Republican from August of 1886, entitled "No, It Wasn't Fanny," and read, I quote, "There has been, since the death of Belle Reader, a report around town that she was the Fanny Davenport who figured so prominently in Salt Lake some time since. But all efforts to substantiate the report have proven futile, and parties who have been acquainted with the deceased for the past 10 years insist that, depraved as she was, she would never have been guilty of doing such acts as did Fanny Davenport." End quote. When Wilford Woodruff passed away in 1899, he left Valley House to his son, Wilford Jr. In November of 1909, the Mormon Church purchased Valley House for $35,000. Newspapers reported that no new building would be built on the site, and it would continue to be used as a hotel, but that the saloon would be moved out. This plan, however, would all change, and Valley House would be demolished for what promised to be a magnificent permanent fixture in the city. Spoilers, it wasn't. For years, there had been talk about Salt Lake needing an interurban train station where all the trains running in and out of the valley would meet. In March of 1914, the Salt Lake and Ogden Railroad, also known as the Bamberger Electric Railroad, from its founder, Simon Bamberger, which ran between, you guessed it, Ogden and Salt Lake, and the Salt Lake and Utah Railroad, which ran between Payson and Salt Lake, announced the formation of the Salt Lake Terminal Company. This new company would be the owner of a new interurban station to be built on West Temple next to the Peary Hotel. It would be constructed of brick and steel with decorative columns and a Mansford roof. Aside from a passenger waiting room, it would also have offices for the railroad companies, rooms for freight and baggage. Simon Bamberger announced the construction would be started at once and would take about a year to complete. This plan, however, never came to fruition because in 1915, the LDS Church offered up the property on which Valley House stood to the Salt Lake Terminal Company. Local businessmen, anticipating an increase in revenue from the station, anteed up another $75,000 to help build a new station. This was an offer that the railroad company could not refuse. This station would cost about $250,000 to build, and the original plans for the building on West Temple would apply to this new site. The train tracks would enter the station 12 feet below the sidewalk, where the ticket office and waiting rooms would be located. The second or ground floor would house businesses, and the third floor would be the general offices for both the railroad companies. In November 1915, Valley House was torn down. A quote from a Salt Lake Telegram article about the demolition sums up the loss of this building. Quote, "The old landmark will exist only in the memory of pioneer citizens who can recall the historic establishment in its palmy days." End quote. Now, the old hotel wasn't demolished for the new station, but for a temporary one. See, it was originally planned to renovate Valley House to use as a temporary station for a few years until all the finances could be secured to build a new one. But after an inspection of the hotel, it was found to be structurally unstable and needed to be torn down. Hence the need for a temporary station. As far as temporary stations go, this one wasn't too shabby. It had everything a train station needed: waiting rooms, ticket offices, baggage rooms, restrooms. It opened in 1916 and would be used for about 3 years when the new Interurban Station would be completed. Fast forward to October of 1923, when the new station was finally opened to much fanfare. Why did it take so long? Well, there was a lot going on in those few years. We had a flu pandemic, World War I, and a recession, so it took a little bit longer to get the building built than what was anticipated. The new Interurban Station, designed by local architects Young and Hansen, was touted as one of the finest stations in the West. The building was constructed of concrete with a glazed varicolored brick and granite facing. The trains entered the basement level, where the trainman's room, express and baggage rooms, and storage rooms were located. Passengers getting off the trains would head up ramps to the main level. Ramps were chosen instead of stairs, as they were viewed to have a higher level of safety than stairs for all of the crowds that would be going through the station. Did I mention the station was huge? All of the following was housed on the main level: a waiting room, ticket office, women's restroom, cigar, candy, and news stations, telephone booth, telegraph stands, men's smoking room, lunchroom, and restaurant. And if that wasn't enough, there were 15 small stores, each with their own entrances. Yep, 15 different stores, so none of them would compete with each other. And we're not done yet. There was also a drugstore and a barbershop. The second floor housed the offices for all the railroad companies. With the opening of this new station, the temporary one was raised. The anticipation was that the station would see a couple million passengers a year. What was not anticipated was the popularity of the automobile. The 1930s saw a substantial increase in auto ownership in the U.S. An article in the Salt Lake Telegram from October 1939 stated the automobile sales were up 52% from the same time the previous year, and sales just kept growing. Combine this with improved roads and highway systems, and the people were able to get around in their own cars and were less inclined to take the train. Ironically, it was Simon Bamberger that pushed for the road improvements when he was governor of the state. By the 40s, buses were also running out of the train station. Bamberger Electric Railroad filed for bankruptcy in 1933 and emerged from the reorganization as the Bamberger Railroad. Then in early 1946, Salt Lake and Utah Railroad stopped all operations, which left Bamberger Railroad the sole owner of the Salt Lake Terminal Company. This name was dropped, and Julian Bamberger, who was now the owner, renamed it the Salt Lake Rail and Bus Terminal Company. Bamberger purchased the Interurban Station in early 1947, and later that year announced that he had sold it to the Overland Greyhound Line. Now, no purchase price was given, but the new owners planned to remodel the station, estimating the cost to be between $100,000 to $150,000. Early 1949 brought the opening of the new Salt Lake Greyhound Bus Depot. This new terminal sported a spacious waiting room, ticket office, drugstore, barbershop, restaurant, and news and gift shop, which represented a whopping $400,000 in renovations. By the 60s, the economic hopes of this station were dwindling as the function of the building became outdated. In 1966, city officials began the construction of a grand civic auditorium that would come to be known as the Salt Palace. With this new auditorium came the need for convenient parking. A mere 45 years after it was built, the old station was demolished. For all things, a parking lot. Today, a Bravenel Hall, home to Utah Symphony, sits on the site. As always, check out the Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolished Salt Lake Podcast to see historic photos associated with these buildings. You can also follow me on Twitter at DemolishedSLPod. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and a rating. Reading ratings make my day. I'll be back in 2 weeks with something a little bit different. Instead of talking about a long-lost historic building, I'll be talking about one that is currently pending demolition, the John B. Kelly House. I hope you'll join me. See you then.